Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of CompGov Command, focusing on Mexico today. And after we do Mexico, we'll probably pivot to the other federal republic in the course, Nigeria. But let's dive in. Let's get some familiarity with some of the political players and the party structures and all that good stuff. Let's get right into it. Vamos a Mexico. All right, friends. So take it from the top. You know how we do this. We start off right with leadership of the government. Right now, the current president is Claudia Scheinbaum, head of the new Morena government, second of the Morena presidents. We'll talk about AMLO later on in the presentation. And she's the first female president of Mexico. And most definitely, her claim to fame these days, besides that landmark achievement, if you had asked me if Mexico would have gotten a female president before the US got a female president or Canada got a female prime minister, I would have been like, what? But it happened. Um, Paso, right? So what we see basically is that she is taking on the very difficult task of trying to fight corruption, just as AMLO first started pushing with Morena, um, by going right to the source and using the military to go after these cartel leaders. First El Mencho, with some help from the U.S., with the CIA helping with the targeting and the intelligence part, but most recently with the second in command of El Mencho in Jalisco State, El Jardinero, the gardener, and that was done completely with her own Mexican special forces with no U.S. assistance. So developing a bit of a reputation for taking it to the cartels, and we'll see if that affects her lifespan at all. But understand that every president of the Mexican nation has to go ahead and understand that they're on borrowed time because of the situation known as the sexenio. You get 1 6-year term in Mexico, and the principle of non-reelection is involved, which means you cannot be president ever again. And we'll talk about why that is. Well, maybe I'll mention it right now, just in brief. During the 19th century, after Mexico achieved independence, going all the way through up until the Constitution of 1917, a series of strongmen, the term for them known as caudillos, ruled the country. And they had leadership spans in some cases up to 30 years. I'm thinking about people like Porfirio Diaz, Benito Juarez was president like multiple times. General Santa Anna was president multiple times. So kind of getting away from that and moving more towards a situation that was more pluralistic, where more people could feasibly become president. They decided to go ahead and have a 6-year fixed term with no reelection. What we find, though, is that feel of the strong central leader didn't just completely vanish with the Constitution of 1917. And you're looking at presidential powers and you're comparing them in the Constitution of the United States and in Mexico. The Mexican president has some powers that go above and beyond the other presidents in North America. For instance, the ability to play around with the budget directly without really talking to Congress much. And maybe we'll touch on those as we move through. But it's a very strong president system within, a democracy, more of a Western style, not like the Eurasian models that we see that don't really jive with us. Definitely more Western hemispheric feel to the democracy that they have. The major parties, basically, it was the PRI or PRI running things throughout the first 70 years or so of the government after the Constitution of 1917 was ratified. Some stalwarts to think about were people like Cardenas in the beginning, who kind of pushed that sort of socialist tinged idea of having some land reforms. Remember, you're not a constitution being made in 1917 without having some semblance of what's going on in the rest of the world. And we should all know alarm bells, 1917 revolutions. We're thinking about what happened in Russia, which later on became the Soviet Union later that very same year. Um, Ever since that moment from the early 20th century all the way up to 2000, PRI was doing everything they could to win a bunch of elections, including maybe playing around with the election tally a little bit in a situation that we call electoral alchemy in this course, um, making some votes count more than others in some instances and discounting some other votes for the sake of other vote. It was, a situation that caused much consternation among the people who thought that PRI, like you're supposed to be representing the revolution and all its ideals, but now you're just centralizing power in that system of democratic centralism that we talked about before with Russia, right? Where you continue to win election after election, which enables you to install key members of your party all over the place. And through spreading favors among party members and playing with the vote, they were able to go ahead and win every election. Although they kind of lost in the 80s when Cardenas's son ran under the PRD banner. I think he kind of won. Most election observers think he kind of won. But again, they played around with the vote to make sure that their candidate won. And they're able to hold PAN, or the National Action Party, down, which was their more conservative rival, all the way until 2000 with the election of Vicente Fox. And what you saw with Fox was basically the first time the PRI had lost handily enough to have to basically admit to the Mexican people that they lost and that they were leaving government. Then the dam sort of broke where PAN won. And then we saw again some PRI candidates come through. But then eventually a whole new coalition led by AMLO, the man who started Morena, and he's able to win. And it's been two Morena wins in a row. And we'll see. Maybe Morena will go on a streak akin to what PRI did. And maybe they begin to play the same games of using the pendulum effect to install individuals that might be in the pipeline for future, runs at the presidency in key spots, like maybe mayors of cities, like was in the case of Scheinbaum, who was mayor of Mexico City before she became president, or maybe governors of certain states, to kind of give them a feel that they're being groomed eventually and being sort of like battle tested and gaining experience to eventually become the president themselves. This is the game that you must play if you want party cohesion when you can't run for reelection. You have to get people in line, tell them that they're in a certain queue, so to speak, to become national leaders, and, basically choose and point out who's going to become the next leader. And that idea of a finger pointing at someone gives us the phrase in Mexican politics known as el dedazo, right? The dedo being finger. So the finger that chooses, I pick you, and then it's you, and it's you, so on and so forth. In terms of Morena's politics, they ran on a leftist sort of populist platform, kind of nebulous, right? They're the ones who are blaming situations such as corporations and other elite business groups are the ones who are making life difficult for the average Mexican person, which kind of jives very well with the overarching sort of historical arc of Mexico, where elite landowners, ever since its history of being a Spanish occupied place, kind of keeping the indigenous down and extracting wealth for their own benefit. That again, it fits the whole vibe of what they're trying to achieve there. And what you basically see is that they, I guess, have decided that maybe some of the elites they should tackle right now who are causing problems would be these cartels. Um, and again, one thing that I have to understand here is that voting is more straightforward from our point of view, from a Western hemispheric point of view in Mexico, but it doesn't really mean that they can't find ways to go ahead and sort of distort the numbers in order to go ahead and get certain candidates to win. It's very, and we know this in America because of the electoral college, right? I mean, we have a vote that we count, the popular vote, and the electoral vote, which individuals are voting based on, I guess. I mean, based on, they don't have to even look at the popular vote, to be honest, but they can vote any way they wish, the electors. So what you basically have is a system that sometimes represents the will of the people and sometimes is a bit skewed, and it represents elite interests more than popular interest. Speaking of popular interest, you do have a lot of individual citizenry getting involved in stuff because of that idea of corporatism, right? Remember how Cardenas was able to go ahead and say, all right, I'm going to make some labor unions. And the government prescribed different labor unions for different sectors of the economy. It's like, okay, now I'm going to make other sort of NGOs and stuff. And in so doing, it kind of defeated the purpose. We're used to grassroots organizations that are organically grown from the bottom up in our politics. It's very strange to think that labor unions and trade unions in Mexico were created by the government in order to give kind of a boost to civil society right out the gate when they made the new constitution. I guess maybe they needed it in that situation because the regular working people's voices had been repressed for so long that as soon as PRI took over, it helped boost their political chances if they had more pro labor groups that they figured would vote for them. So, in that way, that corporatism done by Cardenas at the outset of PRI's development was really as much self-seeking political behavior as it was done for the fiduciary political responsibility of the people of Mexico. When there have been actual grassroots movements, they've been quite dramatic. For instance, you can go right to the 1960s, a time of major upheaval throughout the world, and particularly a very, very contentious year in 1968 when a lot of students came out seeing kind of what's going on in the world, understanding that the Olympics are going to be, Summer Olympics are going to be in Mexico City that year, understanding that the Vietnam War is raging, that there's all sorts of riots all over the streets in United States and whatnot. It was definitely a year of global student revolt and change. And students came out by the thousands, and they were sadly basically cornered in a certain small space by riot police and shot at by snipers at in the event known as the Tlatelolco massacre, and that was pretty brutal. I think that's when people realized that the emperor had no clothes, so to speak, and that the PRI was not really about the revolution ideals anymore. It's really about just fostering its own power, right? Um, at other instances, individuals have been pushing for indigenous rights, and especially when you're looking at certain regions toward the south, right, in like the Chiapas state, Yucatan, right, where you have individuals who identify more with their Mexica ancestors than their actual, like, the mestizo upper class that kind of runs the country. Um, you have had situations where people have been frustrated by cartel violence in their neighborhoods and that pernicious iron triangle that exists between cartel leaders, the police, and the military. And most recently, and this kind of helped to get Scheinbaum sort of on the map politically there, you saw a major protest against femicide and violence against women around the 2023 situation involving a brutal murder of a young girl who apparently the police just figured it was her fault because she went to the club. So I guess that's on her, which sadly is not just a Mexican phenomenon. Multiple nations that are patriarchal in their disposition often victim blame women who suffer violence. So um, all these sorts of things have been able to, sort of get things going there, but understand the basic premise here is that people have only been able to voice concerns to a certain degree because there always is the threat of government repression or cartel violence. This is where people start saying things like, well, maybe Mexico is one of the most productive failed states in the world, because in reality, it's really all about the cartel. It's really not about the will of the Mexican people. And there really isn't going to be a certain leveling up of Mexico's prestige in the world, I think. And after all, it deserves it, right? We're talking about the most overall economically productive Spanish speaking country in the world. A legit, everyone tries to lump it in with like Central America. No, it is one of the big three North American countries, along with the US and Canada. It's a future economic juggernaut. The only problem is people will always see it as backwards until they go ahead and nip this cartel problem in the bud, right? And it's happened to other countries before. Looking at the situation of Japan, right, in the terms of the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, they weren't able to turn a corner and fully modernize and get into a virtuous circle of their development without doing something to sort of neutralize the former samurai class who did not want to modernize, did not want to go forward, right? And an even more recent example is how they made certain concessions to the yakuza, the organized crime syndicates in Japan, to give them some certain legitimate businesses they could get into, and so they could sort of tone down their gang violence in order to go ahead and assimilate a bit better into the overall legal economy. So we'll see how much fighting is done to subdue them and how much bargaining and deal making is done. But it seems right now like Scheinbaum's just trying to fight them, and right now she seems to be winning. But we'll see how that goes. As we recall, Mexico is a federal republic, just like us. They have states, just like us in the US. They have a federal district, just like we do. And just like we do, they have a Congress, right? It's bicameral. The lower level sounds much cooler, in my opinion, than the House of Reps. It's called the Chamber of Deputies. And they have a Senate. And it's a mixture of first past the post voting and proportional representation, as their Congress has a lot more people in it than ours. That is known as parallel voting. So in some cases, you're voting for a person, another who represents your area. In other cases, you're choosing someone who represents a party. It's a little bit of both. And these elections are competitive. Again, the only recently after the PRA finally lost in the year 2000, only recently have they really grown into a multi-party democracy. And now we see a strange situation where the big three political sort of the capital P parties, right, talking about like PAN, PRI, and the leftist PRD, they ran their own coalition against Morena and lost handily to Scheinbaum. So we'll see what kind of interesting blend of these sort of political strange bedfellows with some on the left, some in the center, some on the right. We'll see what ends up evolving here to challenge and try to stop Morena from winning a third term when Scheinbaum's done. The economic story recently in the 90s is as intriguing as the political story, in that you had a legit, mostly resource cursed rentier state ish thing happening, as Mexico is one of the big four oil rich nations in this course, right? Of the oil rich countries, it's Mexico, Nigeria, Iran, and Russia, we just covered, obviously. So in this particular case, they had some partners nearby, the other big two countries in North America, who were their main trade partners as well, who went ahead and decided, we're going to lend you a hand. We're going to help lift you up out of your resource curse because we would like to work with you to build up your manufacturing sector. And not only was it the US and Canada, a big shout to European partners, big shout to Japan, South Korea, later on China, right? Who realized that because some of their best customers were in North America, it made more sense to produce goods in North America for export. So what happens basically is that they take on long leases in order to go ahead and set up what are called maquiladoras, which are factories staffed by Mexican workers, but developing products to sell at export to places like the US, Canada, so on and so forth. So you get the benefit of boosting industrial employment and industrial output for Mexicans. And these are decent paying jobs. In many cases, these are better paying jobs than they could get in other parts of the country. Because as we know, geographically speaking, it's that central valley of Mexico where most of the big cities around Mexico City and Guadalajara are that have most of the urban centers that have the better paying jobs and the higher wages there. But these so there's some maquiladores there, and there are others in that northern expanse of desert adjacent to the American border. So it's very easy to ship and transport goods back and forth. And even to this day, if you want to build something like an F-150 truck or something like that, the parts have to go crisscrossing back and forth across the Canadian to the American border, Mexican border, and back until the truck is done a manner of at least like a dozen times. You can only do this when you sign in the 1990s the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, that was done under the Clinton era in the US, which tore down any sort of tariffs between those three nations and established a free trade zone. It was a North American situation that was the response to what was happening with the European Union across the pond, as they say. And then later on, after about 30 years, then in 2020, during the first Trump administration, you saw then the draft and the creation of the USMCA, which is just, the US, Mexico, and Canada agreement. It doesn't have a fancy name. It's just, USMCA right there. That doubled down on NAFTA and also created protections for intellectual property. So the ideas and designs that were being exchanged and exposed to back and forth, and was meant to also reinforce the rights of Mexican workers in these factories as well. As a result, the resource curse began to sort of fade away, and Mexico has a booming export industrialized manufacturing market now. Just recently made more deals with China to become the largest producer of EVs inside of North America, thanks to the BYD Corporation, their new Chinese partners. So it's going very well for them. If you look at their tree map, you'll find that it's got as much industrial sort of pop to it these days as one from the UK or from China. It is a rising industrial superstar. It turns out Mexican workers can build just about anything that Chinese workers can build or Taiwanese workers can build, especially as the government begins to reach out with better educational platforms and continues to boost literacy. That being said, one of the vestiges you get from dominant party rule is individuals who are used to their political power and flexing it on people, and this situation with corruption involving the cartels. That is one thing tamping down this industrial growth, are public officials that are on the take from the cartel, or public officials that are maybe transferring their patronage from the cartels to some of these corporations overseas to set up these maquiladoras, right? So as a result, there's a changing of the guard taking place, where some officials, for instance, AMLO, which is an acronym for a person, right? Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, right? He, as soon as he became president before Scheinbaum, he went on a spree of trying to purge lots of former PRI officials from appointed places. So sometimes reforms that maybe Moreno was trying to push didn't really work out so well because they were blocked by certain kinds of judges, certain types of appointees and bureaucrats. So it's going to take some time to go ahead and get all these reform movements to get fixed and everything. So a bit of upheaval in that regard is tamping down some of these reforms. Who's really in charge here? This is a strong president model, not hyper presidential like we saw with Putin, where the vertical of power kicks in. Because a lot of that stuff from the vertical of power happens informally, where this is actually baked into the cake, so to speak. The Mexican Constitution gives the president a great deal of power compared to other similar constitutions. Um, Congress as well has veto abilities in some instances, and they're powerful as well. The court system in Mexico is evolving, is changing. One cool thing to note about that is um, one restriction against overarching and maybe almost too powerful judiciary power is the situation of the 15-year term in the Supreme Court of Mexico. So you can't just stay there for life. Um, some observers of the American system might be like, interesting. Might want to incorporate that in a future amendment for us. But as a result, when elected officials have more power than on the whole than judges do, then these party elites who are the individuals who have held power, maybe past presidents, maybe individuals who are former governors of certain states, they form shadowy back channel groups with much prestige and power known as camarillas. And the camarillas are able to go ahead and shape some of the actions and some of the dynamics of power in the existing elected officials, policy making decisions. And of course, the ultimate expression of that would be the idea of choosing who the next candidates will be for the election process, and the idea of the dedazo, right, where we're selecting candidates before they're being elected, right? As well, a big one here, and I put it in bold because it's major. We'll see it not just here, but we'll see it in Nigeria as well. And basically, I don't know. I mean, you could probably find patron client networks all over the place in this course, but in particular, we see here that I mean, going back to the PRI example, when Cardenas decides to go ahead and nationalize Pemex, for instance, which is the Mexican Petroleum Corporation, and make it nationalized, which means make it so that it it will be staffed and it will only sell to the Mexican people and produce with Mexican workers. That joins Pemex at the hip to PRI, so they're now partners together, right? That's how the patron client network works. That PRI has like basically taken Pemex under its wing, and so anything that it can do, so it's going to get its workers to vote PRI. It's going to do ad campaigns to support the PRI and boost up its prestige. All of that stuff done purposely to go ahead and help both sides win. Because as long as PRI is in power, then Pemex is protected from any sort of political attack. Um, there could be instances in which maybe, especially the case on the outskirts, right, toward the north and the south, where some states might be kind of far away from the prying eyes of federal officials in Mexico City. Maybe up in the north, states like Sonora, states like Chihuahua, right there along the American border. Um, you might have patron client networks where maybe the local governor is in cahoots, possibly, or some of his officials secretly in cahoots, and their clients are cartel leaders, or maybe it's inverted. Maybe in reality, it's the cartel leader that's in charge, and these elected officials are the clients. So these back channel situations loom very large in Mexican politics. But despite the fact that on paper you have a pretty stable elected government system, it's the administration thereof, it's the enforcement thereof that can become problematic sometimes. Although, like I'm saying right now, Scheinbaum's off to a flying start, and I wish her luck on that. When we get to the PRI era, again, that was a dominant party situation that they ran from roughly 1930 or so all the way up until the year 2000. Um, that's kind of akin to a situation that our friend Mr. Putin in United Russia is kind of starting right now. The infancy is sort of beginning right now in terms of what's happening with the Duma and his party's control over all the seats there. But again, in the year 2000, major changes began to unfold, and we start to see other parties winning. We'll see something very similar, a very exciting development in Nigerian electoral history around the same time frame of 1999, 2000 ish. One thing, too, that's important to note is that Mexico and also what we're going to see with Nigeria kind of had to tear down some of their import substitution and start privatizing some industries because they had fallen behind on some loans that they had secured from individuals like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and whatnot. Um, and so oftentimes those organizations work with corporate partners in wealthier countries like the UK in this class or like the US in real life, um, to go ahead and help find profitable ways to not only earn funds to grow the economy, but also pay those loans back, right? And so this instability caused by basically poor administration of resources and some bad luck. Like for instance, Mexico is riding pretty high with Pemex during the Arab oil embargo in the 70s. But then during the 80s, once both Iran and Iraq start selling more oil to the world to get more money to go ahead and buy more weapons to fight each other, there and therefore, like that glut of new crude into the market kind of starts to take away from some of their funds. And they had borrowed some money from the World Bank and the IMF based on their gains during the 70s. And they weren't actually paying back that same amount because they weren't earning as much. There's a lot of detail there, but just know that eventually global impacts on the oil trade kind of made the Mexican economy stumble, which was too reliant on oil, and kind of moved them towards maybe we should diversify, maybe we should work with our North American partners and open up, even though, you know, maybe Pemex isn't the best company now to compete with a Chevron from the States or maybe a Conoco from Canada. It would end up in the long run being better off for us if we go ahead and let, more private interests get involved in the Mexican economy. The current legend who started the Morena movement, who argued that he probably was denied a previous election earlier in the 2000s, who then left the big three of the PR party, the P parties, and then created the Morena movement, the Movimiento por Regeneración Nacional, right? So the movement for the regeneration of the nation, or again, kind of awkwardly, to make Mexico great again. Populism, just left style populism, not right style populism. He's all about pushing anti-corruption, social welfare, and the idea of us versus them, elites versus us, the regular people. Pretty sure he's an elite. After all, his last name kind of ends in something that kind of can be loosely translated into O'Brien, right, on an Irish tip. So he's clearly a mestizo. So he's part of that same ruling class, but claiming like, no, like I'm with you, and that's cool. That's all good. But I kind of, you got to call a spade, right? I mean, say what you want, but think about this: two nation states in North America have universal health care, and the United States is not one of them, right? Both Canada and Mexico both have universal health care. In many cases, individuals will cross south of the border from the United States to get medicines and get treatments that they can't get because they're too costly in the States. That's a thing. And that's sort of what is the example of initiative that people like AMLO, that left wing populism, are trying to push. Doing more with the government's resources to help the people directly and to help elites less. So here's the key themes. They're undergoing a moment in the sun of democracy and dismantling dominant party rule by the PRI, and yet there's still challenges to corruption from party stalwarts who are still in appointed positions to iron triangle domination of cartel money and cartel power, right? To combat this, they do have a strong president, and the strong president has a will to fight these institutional problems from within and without. There is a chance to go ahead and make some real changes. However, it's not going to be easy. Outside of the general sphere of the Central Valley of Mexico, where most of the actual people live, and especially most of the educated people live, and the government bureaucrats live, toward the fringes of the country, you do have a very weak rule of law that allows, in some cases, drugs to move very freely, and in other cases, people to move very freely, as coyotes make very lucrative sort of livings out there, human trafficking. Um, the net immigration, though, into the US from Mexico by Mexicans themselves is actually like net zero now, as many people find that the Mexican economy is booming and there's really no need, or at least not booming, is growing at the same pace, if not slightly faster than the US economy. So there's no real need to rush into the US. And as many people have come back to Mexico from the US as have gone recently. Um, but we can't forget about the elephant in the room, which is the cartels, right? This is why some people still to this day feel like Mexico is a quote unquote narco state. One thing they might ask you is about democratization, how it went down, I guess how it's evolving well in Mexico, although not perfect, and how it went completely off the rails in Russia. Um, Explaining things like the sexenio, the dedazo, right? Um, the way that the Constitution tilts toward the president, how does that have impact on institutions, both formally and informally? And so just understand that this is one of those countries, along with Nigeria, where they're going to hammer you on patron client relations on the one hand, and also hammer you on import substitution to structural adjustment. But don't worry, we're going to get back into that again, both of those themes in Nigeria as well. Here's your takeaway. Mexico is a transitioning democracy where competitive elections coexist with corruption, informal power networks, and challenges to state authority, right? It's moving in the right direction, the Mexican government. It just needs to keep moving that way. Um, there will be bumps along the road, but I have hope with strong economic partners and with a much more lively and open party system to espouse, to enable more Mexicans to speak to their political truths. I have hope in the future that Mexico has a brighter political future and will become the legit member of the three amigos, as it were, of the advanced North American states. So, with that, let's wrap it right there. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time with Nigeria. Peace. Adios.